My daughter's teacher called at midnight screaming that my daughter poisoned half her class and the police were on their way. The phone rang at 12:03 a.m., and I knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. Nobody calls at midnight with good news. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, knocking over a glass of water in the process. The screen showed Mrs. Brennan's name, my daughter's third-grade teacher. My stomach dropped before I even answered. Her voice came through the speaker, high-pitched and shaking with rage I'd never heard from her before. She said 6 children were in the emergency room right now. Severe allergic reactions, hives covering their bodies, throats swelling shut. 2 kids had needed EpiPens stabbed into their thighs. She said my daughter, Nora, brought homemade brownies to class for her birthday, and now children were fighting to breathe in hospital beds. Mrs. Brennan's words came faster, angrier. She said she'd told Nora specifically, multiple times, that several students had severe peanut allergies, that anything brought to class had to be completely nut-free. Nora had nodded and promised, Mrs. Brennan said. She'd looked the teacher right in the eyes and sworn the brownies were safe, but the hospital found peanut butter in the brownies, traces throughout the entire batch. Mrs. Brennan's voice cracked as she said one child, a little girl named Chloe, had stopped breathing in the ambulance. They'd revived her, but she was in pediatric intensive care right now. The police were getting involved because this wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Mrs. Brennan said she'd overheard Nora telling another student last week that she was tired of the allergy kids ruining everything, that they were probably faking it for attention. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My wife Diane stirred beside me, squinting at me in the darkness. I told Mrs. Brennan there had to be a mistake. Nora was 8 years old. She wouldn't deliberately hurt anyone. Mrs. Brennan cut me off with a bitter laugh that didn't sound like her at all. She said the police would be at our house within the hour to question Nora, that I needed to wake my daughter up and figure out what the hell she'd done. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone screen, my hands shaking. Diane was sitting up now, asking what was wrong. I couldn't form words for a moment. Then I told her what Mrs. Brennan had said and watched my wife's face go from confusion to horror to disbelief in seconds. We rushed down the hallway to Nora's room. The nightlight shaped like a unicorn cast soft purple shadows on the walls covered in her crayon drawings. She was sleeping peacefully, her brown hair spread across her pillow, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2. Looking at her like this, innocent and small, I couldn't reconcile what Mrs. Brennan had said. This was our daughter, who cried when she accidentally stepped on an ant, who insisted we rescue spiders instead of killing them, who made get-well cards for classmates when they were sick. I shook her shoulder gently, and she stirred, blinking up at me with sleepy confusion. I asked her about the brownies she'd brought to school. Her face changed immediately. The sleepiness vanished, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Nora sat up in bed, pulling her knees to her chest. She asked in a small voice if the kids were okay. My stomach twisted. That meant she knew something had happened. I asked her directly if she put peanut butter in the brownies. She nodded slowly, tears starting to well up in her eyes. She said she didn't think it would be this bad. She thought maybe they'd get a little itchy and everyone would see the allergies weren't as serious as they pretended. She said the allergy kids got special treatment all the time. Special snacks, special seating. Everyone had to change what they brought because of them. She'd heard some kids at lunch saying the allergies were probably fake to get attention. Nora had wanted to prove it. She'd wanted to show everyone that nothing bad would really happen. She was crying hard now, saying she was sorry, that she didn't know people could actually die from allergies. Diane and I looked at each other over Nora's head, and I saw my own horror reflected in her eyes. Our 8-year-old daughter had deliberately poisoned 6 children because she thought their medical conditions were lies, because she was tired of accommodations for disabled kids. The doorbell rang downstairs and we both flinched. The police had arrived faster than Mrs. Brennan predicted. I told Nora to stay in her room while we talked to them first. She grabbed my hand, her small fingers cold and trembling. She asked if she was going to jail. I didn't know how to answer that. I told her we'd figure it out and pulled my hand away, heading downstairs with Diane right behind me. 2 officers stood on our porch, one older with gray hair, one younger who looked barely out of the academy. They showed their badges and asked if they could come inside to talk about the incident at Oakwood Elementary. We sat in the living room while the officers explained the situation from their perspective. 6 children hospitalized, 1 in critical condition. The hospital had tested the brownies and found significant amounts of peanut protein. Mrs. Brennan had provided a statement that she'd explicitly warned Nora multiple times about the allergies. Another student had come forward, saying Nora had talked about wanting to prove the allergies were fake. The younger officer said they needed to speak with Nora directly. I asked if we needed a lawyer present, and the older officer said that was our right, but they just wanted to understand what happened. They weren't arresting anyone tonight. They just needed Nora's statement. Diane went upstairs to get Nora while I sat there feeling like the floor had opened up beneath me. How had we failed to teach our daughter that allergies were real and serious? Where had she gotten the idea that accommodations for other kids were somehow unfair to her? Nora came downstairs in her pajamas, her face blotchy from crying. She sat between Diane and me on the couch, looking tiny and terrified. The older officer, whose name was Detective Morales, spoke to her gently. He asked her to tell him about the brownies she brought to school. Nora's voice was barely above a whisper as she explained. She said she'd helped me make brownies the night before for her birthday treat. Regular brownies with no peanuts. But after I went to bed, she'd gone back downstairs and made a second batch. She'd found the jar of peanut butter in the pantry and mixed it into the batter. She'd baked them herself and let them cool, then threw away the safe batch I'd made and put her batch in the container instead. She'd known exactly what she was doing. She'd planned it. The younger officer was taking notes while Detective Morales maintained his calm expression, but I could see the judgment in his eyes. Detective Morales asked Nora why she'd done it. She said she'd heard kids talking at school about how the allergy kids were probably faking to get special treatment. She said it wasn't fair that everyone had to change their lunches and snacks because of 5 or 6 kids. She'd thought if she proved the allergies weren't real, everything could go back to normal. Everyone could bring whatever they wanted again. Detective Morales asked if she'd known that kids could die from allergic reactions. Nora hesitated, then nodded. She said she'd known people could die, but she thought that was only if they ate a lot of peanuts. She'd only put a little bit in, just enough to make them itchy. She'd thought the EpiPens would fix it if anything went wrong. She started crying again, saying she didn't mean for anyone to almost die. Detective Morales closed his notebook and looked at Diane and me. He said they'd be filing charges. Nora was below the age of criminal responsibility, but there would be consequences. After the police left, Diane and I sat in stunned silence. Nora had gone back to her room, and we could hear her crying through the ceiling. I couldn't process what had just happened. My daughter had methodically planned to poison her classmates. She'd deceived me, used ingredients from our kitchen, baked a second batch while we slept, and swapped them out. The premeditation was what horrified me most. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. She'd thought it through. Diane said we needed to call a lawyer immediately. I agreed, but I also said we needed to figure out where Nora had gotten these ideas. She didn't come up with the theory that allergies were fake on her own. Someone had planted that seed. We needed to know who and why. Diane pulled out her phone and started searching for family lawyers while I went upstairs to check on Nora. She was curled up on her bed, facing the wall. I sat down beside her, and she didn't move. I asked her who had told her that allergies weren't real. She said nobody told her exactly, but she'd heard kids talking about it at school. Kids whose parents complained about the allergy rules. She said one kid's mom had posted on Facebook that the school was being ridiculous with all the restrictions, that when she was young, nobody had allergies, and kids were fine. Nora had seen it when the kid showed his tablet during recess. I felt my anger shift slightly. Nora had made a horrific choice, but she'd been influenced by adults who should have known better. Parents who spread misinformation and complained about accommodations for disabled children. That didn't excuse what Nora did, but it explained where the idea had come from. I told Nora that allergies were absolutely real, that Chloe could have died tonight because of what she'd done, and that there would be serious consequences. My phone rang at 2:18 a.m., the hospital calling. My blood turned to ice. They said Chloe's condition had stabilized, but she'd be in the ICU for at least another day. 3 other children had been discharged, but 2 were still under observation. The nurse said Chloe's parents wanted to speak with me. She put Mr. Reeves on the line, and his voice was hoarse from crying. He said his daughter had been healthy this morning, and now she was hooked up to machines because my daughter had tried to prove her allergy wasn't real. He said Chloe had been bullied all year about her allergies. Kids had tried to sneak peanuts into her desk, had chased her around the playground with peanut butter sandwiches, had called her a faker and attention seeker, and now this. Now Nora had actually succeeded in poisoning her. Mr. Reeves said he was pressing charges. He wanted Nora held accountable to the fullest extent possible. I told him I was sorry, that we had no idea Nora felt this way, that we were devastated. He hung up on me. Diane found a lawyer named Patricia Odom, who specialized in juvenile cases. She agreed to meet us first thing in the morning. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. At 6 a.m., Diane and I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while Nora stayed in her room. The local news was already covering the story. Mass poisoning at elementary school, the headline read. They didn't name Nora because she was a minor, but they had details. 6 children hospitalized after eating brownies containing peanuts. 1 child in critical condition. School officials investigating. Parents outraged. I turned off the TV before they could show interviews with angry parents. My phone was blowing up with texts from other parents, some sympathetic, most hostile. One message said, "We should be ashamed of ourselves for raising a monster." Another said, "Nora should be expelled and never allowed around children again." I put my phone face down on the table. We met Patricia Odom at her office at 9 a.m. She was in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that took in everything. We explained the situation while Nora sat silently beside us. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When we finished, she said, "This was serious, very serious. Nora was 8, which meant she couldn't be charged criminally, but the school district could expel her. The parents could file civil suits for medical expenses and emotional distress. Child Protective Services would likely investigate our home. There could be a finding of neglect depending on how they viewed our supervision. Patricia said we needed to be prepared for our lives to change drastically. She said the best course of action was full cooperation with all investigations, immediate counseling for Nora to address whatever led to this behavior, and sincere apologies to every affected family. She emphasized that last part. Sincere apologies, not excuses. The school board called an emergency meeting for that evening. Parents were demanding answers. Principal Hartley had sent an email that morning informing families that the student responsible had been identified and would face disciplinary action. The email didn't name Nora, but everyone knew. Our neighbors had stopped making eye contact when we got home from the lawyer's office. Someone had spray-painted poisoner on our garage door. Diane called the police to report it, but the officer who came out said he'd file a report, though he couldn't promise much. He said feelings were running high in the community right now. He suggested we might want to keep Nora inside for her own safety. That's when it really hit me that our daughter wasn't just in legal trouble. She was in physical danger from angry parents and community members who saw her as a threat to their children. The school board meeting was held in the auditorium, which was packed with parents. Diane and I arrived with Patricia and immediately felt the hostility in the room. People stopped talking when they saw us. Some glared openly. Others whispered to each other, not bothering to hide that they were talking about us. We sat in the back while Patricia sat closer to the front. Principal Hartley opened the meeting by reviewing what had happened. She confirmed that a student had brought brownies containing peanuts to class, despite explicit instructions about allergies. 6 children had been hospitalized. The school was reviewing all policies regarding classroom treats and celebrations. Then she opened the floor for public comment. Dozens of hands shot up. Mr. Reeves was called first. He stood at the microphone with his wife beside him, both of them looking exhausted and furious. He described finding out his daughter had stopped breathing, described the terror of riding in the ambulance, described watching doctors work on Chloe while she lay unconscious. Mr. Reeves said this wasn't just about his daughter. This was about a culture that treated accommodations for disabled children as burdens rather than necessities. He said his daughter had been bullied all year because of her allergy. Teachers had failed to address it. Parents had complained about the nut-free policies. And now a child had weaponized that attitude and nearly killed 6 kids. He said the student responsible should be expelled permanently. That wasn't enough, he said. The parents should be investigated for neglect. How did an 8-year-old get the idea that deliberately poisoning classmates was acceptable? He said he wanted criminal charges filed even though the child was below the age of responsibility. He wanted the prosecutor's office to find a way. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Diane grabbed my hand and squeezed hard. I felt sick. Other parents spoke, most echoing Mr. Reeves. They wanted Nora expelled. They wanted us investigated. Some wanted us charged as parents for failing to supervise our daughter. One mother said we should be forced to pay all medical bills. Another said we should have to move away so their children would feel safe at school again. A few parents spoke in defense of due process, saying we shouldn't rush to judgment, but they were shouted down. The mob mentality was overwhelming. I wanted to stand up and speak, to apologize, to explain, but Patricia had forbidden it. She said anything I said could be used in civil suits later. So I sat there and took it while dozens of parents called my daughter a monster and called me and Diane failures. After 2 hours, Principal Hartley said the school board would meet privately to discuss disciplinary action. The meeting was adjourned. As we tried to leave, several parents blocked our path. Security had to escort us out. The next morning, Child Protective Services showed up at our door. A woman named Angela Foster introduced herself and said she needed to inspect our home and interview Nora. This was standard protocol when a child harmed others, she explained. We let her in because we had no choice. She spent an hour walking through our house, taking notes, asking questions. Was Nora supervised when using the kitchen? Had we noticed any concerning behavior before this incident? Did we have family history of violence or mental illness? Did Nora have access to weapons or dangerous substances? I answered everything honestly while feeling like a suspect in my own home. Angela spent time alone with Nora in her room while Diane and I waited downstairs. When she came out, she said she'd be filing a report with recommendations. She didn't say what those recommendations would be. She left, and we felt violated and terrified of what might come next. Patricia called that afternoon with news from the school board. Nora was expelled, effective immediately. She would not be allowed to attend any school in the district for the remainder of the academic year. We could apply for readmission next fall, but there were no guarantees. We'd need to provide evidence of counseling and remediation. Additionally, we were banned from all school property and school events. If we had other children in the district, which we didn't, they would be allowed to stay, but we couldn't attend their activities. Patricia said it could have been worse. Some board members had pushed for a permanent expulsion. She said we should consider this a small win. I didn't feel like we'd won anything. My daughter was expelled at 8 years old. We'd have to figure out homeschooling or private school, neither of which we could really afford. And the civil suits were just beginning. Patricia said 3 families had already filed. The lawsuits came fast. The Reeves family sued for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. Two other families filed similar suits. Patricia said the medical expenses alone could be substantial. ICU stays, emergency services, follow-up care, therapy for trauma. We were looking at potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Our homeowner's insurance might cover some of it, but probably not all. We might lose our house. Diane broke down crying when Patricia explained this. We'd worked so hard for this house. We'd saved for years for the down payment. Now we might lose everything because our daughter had believed misinformation and made a catastrophic choice. I felt angry at Nora, then guilty for feeling angry at an 8-year-old, then angry at the adults who'd spread the lies she believed. The emotions were overwhelming and contradictory. I started investigating where Nora had gotten her information. She'd mentioned seeing a Facebook post from another kid's mother. I created a fake profile and started searching parent groups associated with the school. What I found made me sick. Multiple parents posting complaints about the allergy policies, calling the accommodations ridiculous, saying kids today were too coddled, claiming that allergies were overdiagnosed and most kids would be fine if exposed. One mother had posted an article from a discredited doctor claiming peanut allergies were largely psychosomatic. Another had shared a meme joking about sneaking peanuts into school lunches. The comment sections were full of parents agreeing, complaining, mocking the allergy families. This was the environment our children were growing up in. Adults modeling disbelief and resentment of medical accommodations. I screenshot everything and sent it to Patricia, thinking maybe it would help show Nora had been influenced by this culture. Patricia said it might help in court, but it didn't excuse what Nora did. Nora started counseling with a child psychologist named Dr. Vernon. He specialized in behavioral issues in young children. After the first session, he called me and Diane in for a parent meeting. He said Nora was struggling with understanding the severity of what she'd done. She knew intellectually that she'd hurt people, but she hadn't fully processed that her actions could have killed Chloe. He said 8-year-olds don't have fully developed capacity for understanding long-term consequences or abstract concepts like death. That didn't mean she shouldn't be held accountable, but it meant we needed to approach this developmentally. He recommended intensive therapy twice a week, social skills training, and education about disabilities and accommodations. He also recommended family therapy because this would impact all of us. He said the trauma of being expelled, sued, and socially ostracized would affect Nora's development significantly. We needed professional help to navigate it. The news coverage intensified. National outlets picked up the story. Third grader poisons classmates over peanut allergy dispute, ran in multiple papers. Think pieces were written about children mimicking adult prejudices against disabled people. Some articles sympathized with Nora, calling her a child who'd been failed by adults spreading misinformation. Others called for harsh punishment, arguing that 8 was old enough to know better. Comment sections were vicious. People called Nora evil, called us terrible parents, said we should lose custody. I stopped reading them, but Diane couldn't help herself. She'd spend hours scrolling through comments, torturing herself with strangers' judgments. I finally took her phone away and made her promise to stop. We needed to focus on our family, not on what people who didn't know us thought. 3 weeks after the incident, Chloe Reeves was released from the hospital. The local news covered it, showing her walking out with her parents, still looking weak and pale. Mrs. Reeves gave a statement thanking the medical staff and saying they were grateful Chloe had survived. She said they hoped this incident would lead to changes in how schools addressed bullying related to disabilities. She didn't mention Nora by name, but everyone knew who she meant. That evening, someone threw a brick through our living room window. The brick had a note attached that said, "Your daughter is a murderer." We called the police again. They said they'd increase patrols in our neighborhood, but they couldn't station an officer at our house permanently. They suggested we might want to consider relocating. That's when Diane said, maybe we should. Maybe we should move away, start over somewhere else where nobody knew what had happened. I didn't know if running away was the answer, but I couldn't argue that staying here felt sustainable. The preliminary hearing for the civil suits happened in October. We sat in a courtroom while lawyers argued about liability and damages. The plaintiff's attorneys painted Nora as a calculating child who'd meticulously planned an attack. They presented her statement to police as evidence of premeditation. They brought up the Facebook posts I'd found, arguing that we'd failed to monitor what content Nora was exposed to online. Our attorney Patricia argued that Nora was 8 years old, below the age of criminal responsibility, and had been influenced by a broader culture of misinformation. She argued that the family's medical expenses should be covered by our insurance, and that claims for emotional distress were excessive given Nora's age. The judge listened to both sides and said she'd issue a ruling on whether the cases could proceed. We left the courthouse feeling defeated. Even if we won legally, we'd lost everything else. Dr. Vernon called me after Nora's 8th session. He said she'd made a breakthrough in understanding what she'd done. During the session, he'd asked her to draw a picture of how she thought Chloe felt in the hospital. Nora had drawn a picture of a small girl in a bed surrounded by machines, with her parents crying beside her. Then, Nora had started crying and said she'd done that. She'd put Chloe in that bed. Dr. Vernon said this was the first time Nora had really connected her actions to someone else's suffering. Before, she'd been focused on her own consequences, being expelled, being hated. disappointing us. But now she was starting to understand what Chloe had experienced. Dr. Vernon said this was progress, but it also meant Nora would likely struggle with guilt for years. She'd carry this with her into adolescence and adulthood. Her brain would keep reprocessing it as she developed. He wanted us to be prepared for that. I couldn't stop thinking about the parents who'd spread misinformation online, the ones who'd complained about accommodations and questioned the validity of allergies. I wondered if they felt any responsibility for what happened. I doubted it. People rarely connected their words to consequences like this. They'd probably say they were just venting frustration, that they never intended for a child to act on their complaints. But intentions didn't matter. Their words had created an environment where my daughter thought it was acceptable to test whether allergies were real by poisoning her classmates. I contacted a reporter who'd covered the story fairly and asked if she'd be interested in investigating the broader context. She said yes. Over the next 2 weeks, she interviewed parents from the Facebook groups, teachers who'd witnessed the bullying of allergy kids, and disability advocates. Her article came out in November, and it was damning. It exposed the culture of resentment toward accommodations that had been festering in our community for years. The article changed nothing and everything. People who'd been spreading misinformation denied responsibility. They said their private comments weren't meant to be taken literally. They said they'd never encouraged children to harm anyone, but some parents were fired from their jobs when employers saw what they'd posted. One woman who'd shared the article about allergies being psychosomatic lost her position on the school board. The school district announced new policies about bullying related to disabilities and mandatory training for staff on accommodation requirements. It felt like progress, but it didn't undo what Nora had done. It didn't bring back the innocence of 6 children who'd been poisoned. It didn't erase Chloe's time in the ICU or the trauma her family experienced. The systemic issues were being addressed, but the individual harm remained. The judge ruled in December that the civil suits could proceed to trial. She said there was sufficient evidence that Nora had acted with knowledge that her actions could cause harm, and that we as parents could be held liable. Patricia explained that this was expected. Judges rarely dismissed cases at the preliminary stage. We'd have our day in court to present our full defense. But the ruling meant months more of legal proceedings, thousands more in attorney fees, and the looming possibility of a judgment that would bankrupt us. Diane wanted to settle. She said we should offer what we could and try to move on. I understood her perspective, but I also felt like settling was admitting we'd failed as parents. Patricia said we needed to separate feelings from strategy. Settlement wasn't about guilt. It was about limiting damages and ending the proceedings so our family could heal. We authorized her to start negotiations. Nora turned 9 in January. We didn't celebrate. How could we? A year ago, we'd thrown her a party with friends and cake and decorations. This year, she was expelled in therapy twice a week and hated by the community. We made her a small cake and sang to her at home, just the 3 of us. She cried through the whole song. Afterward, she said she didn't deserve a birthday after what she'd done. I told her that everyone deserved basic dignity and love, even when they'd made terrible mistakes, that we loved her and would always love her. But that love didn't mean avoiding consequences. It meant supporting her through them. She asked if the kids she'd hurt would ever forgive her. I said honestly that I didn't know. Some might someday, others might not. She'd have to learn to live with that uncertainty. The settlement negotiations dragged on for months. The Reeves family wanted $500,000. 2 other families wanted $150,000 each. We offered $50,000 total from our savings, to be split among all 3 families, plus an agreement to cover any medical expenses not paid by insurance. They rejected it immediately. Patricia said we needed to be realistic. Our homeowner's insurance would cover up to $300,000 in liability. We'd need to offer most of that to get them to settle. But that meant admitting we were liable for Nora's actions. It meant accepting financial responsibility for what our daughter had done. Diane and I fought about it. She wanted to protect our assets and our future. I felt like we owed these families something substantial. We couldn't give them back their children's innocence or trauma-free childhoods, but we could acknowledge the harm through compensation. Eventually, we agreed to offer $400,000 total, covered by insurance and our savings. The families accepted in March. With the settlements finalized, we could finally focus on moving forward. We'd decided to relocate to a different state. Diane had a job offer in Colorado, and I could work remotely. We'd sold our house to cover the portion of the settlement our insurance hadn't paid. We'd be starting over with almost nothing, but at least we'd be somewhere Nora could try to have a normal childhood. Dr. Vernon had referred us to a colleague in Denver who specialized in children with trauma histories. He said Nora would need continued support, but he was optimistic about her long-term prognosis. She'd demonstrated genuine remorse and was developing empathy. She'd never forget what she'd done, but with proper support, she could become a healthy, functional adult who learned from this catastrophic mistake. I wanted to believe him. Before we left, I did something I'd been avoiding. I wrote letters to each of the families whose children Nora had harmed. I apologized for what my daughter had done. I acknowledged the harm and trauma they'd experienced. I explained that we were moving away, but that we'd never forget what happened. I said we hoped their children would heal and that someday they might find it in their hearts to forgive Nora, even if they could never forgive us. I didn't expect responses, and I didn't get any except one. Mrs. Reeves sent a brief email saying she appreciated the apology, but that words couldn't undo what had been done. She said Chloe still had nightmares about not being able to breathe, that she panicked when anyone offered her food, she hadn't prepared herself, that their daughter's innocence had been stolen by someone she'd trusted. The email ended with a single line. I hope Nora learns from this and never hurts anyone again. We moved to Denver in June. Nora would start 4th grade at a new school in the fall. We'd enrolled her under her middle name to avoid recognition if anyone searched her first name online. Patricia had helped us seal the court records to protect Nora's privacy, but we knew the internet never forgot. Someday someone might connect the dots. We'd deal with that if it happened. For now, we focused on helping Nora heal. She was doing better, still in therapy, still carrying guilt, but also laughing sometimes, making art, reading books, showing glimpses of the child she'd been before she'd made the worst decision of her young life. Dr. Vernon's colleague, Dr. Patel, said Nora was remarkably resilient. She said children who experienced consequences and received proper support often developed strong moral compasses because they'd learned firsthand the impact of their choices. The first day of school in Denver was terrifying for all of us. Nora was anxious about making friends, worried that somehow kids would know what she'd done. Diane and I were anxious about letting her out of our sight, about trusting that she wouldn't hurt anyone again. But Dr. Patel had said we couldn't keep her isolated forever. She needed normal social interactions to develop properly. So we walked her to her new classroom and introduced her to Mrs. Kowalski, who seemed kind and patient. Nora turned back to us at the door, her eyes wide with fear. I told her she could do this, that she was brave and strong and capable of good things. She nodded and went inside. Diane cried in the car on the way home. I held her hand and told her it would be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed it. 6 months into our new life, something unexpected happened. We received a letter forwarded from our old address. It was from Chloe Reeves. The handwriting was careful and childlike. She'd written that her therapist had suggested writing to Nora might help her process what had happened. She said she'd been very sick because of the brownies and had been scared. She said she didn't understand why Nora had done it, but her therapist explained that sometimes kids believed wrong things because adults told them wrong information. Chloe wrote that she forgave Nora because holding anger made her stomach hurt. She said she hoped Nora was being more careful now and learning about allergies. At the bottom, she'd drawn a picture of 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. The letter destroyed me. This 9-year-old child who'd nearly died was offering forgiveness, while I was still struggling to forgive myself for failing to prevent this. I showed the letter to Dr. Patel during our next family session. She asked Nora how it made her feel. Nora said it made her feel sad and grateful and guilty all at once. Sad because Chloe had been so scared. Grateful because Chloe didn't hate her. Guilty because she didn't deserve forgiveness. Dr. Patel asked if Nora wanted to write back. Nora said yes, but she didn't know what to say. Dr. Patel suggested we work on it together in therapy. Over the next 3 sessions, Nora drafted a letter. She apologized for hurting Chloe. She explained that she'd believed wrong things about allergies, but now she understood they were real and serious. She said she was learning about disabilities and accommodations in therapy. She thanked Chloe for forgiving her and said she'd remember Chloe's kindness forever. She said she hoped Chloe was feeling better and that she was safe and happy. At the end, Nora drew her own picture of 2 stick figures under a rainbow, mirroring Chloe's drawing. We mailed the letter through Patricia, who forwarded it to the Reeves family. I didn't know if they'd give it to Chloe or if we'd hear back. But 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. Chloe had written back, a shorter note saying she was glad Nora was learning and that she hoped Nora had nice friends at her new school. She said her mom read her Nora's letter, and it made her mom cry, but in a good way. The correspondence continued sporadically over the following year. Short letters exchanged every few months. Nora and Chloe weren't friends exactly. They'd probably never meet again. But they'd formed a strange connection forged through trauma and forgiveness. Dr. Patel said this was incredibly healthy for both of them. Nora was learning that she could be forgiven and still carry responsibility. Chloe was learning that people who hurt her weren't monsters, just humans, capable of terrible mistakes and growth. 2 years after the incident, Nora was thriving in Denver. She'd made friends, joined the art club, and was excelling academically. She'd become passionate about disability rights and had asked to volunteer with an advocacy organization when she was old enough. She still saw Dr. Patel monthly, and probably would for years to come. The guilt hadn't disappeared, but she'd learned to carry it without letting it crush her. She'd learned that mistakes, even catastrophic ones, didn't have to define her entire life, that she could choose to become someone who fought to protect people rather than someone who harmed them. Diane and I had also healed, slowly. We'd rebuilt our lives in Denver, made new friends, found new routines. We'd learned to forgive ourselves for not seeing the warning signs, for not monitoring Nora more closely, for not counteracting the misinformation she'd been exposed to. We'd learned that perfect parenting was impossible, and that all we could do was our best with the information and resources we had. The Facebook groups that had spread misinformation about allergies were still active, I discovered when I checked recently. Different parents now, same complaints. Someone would eventually do something similar to what Nora did, I realized. Another child would believe the lies and test whether allergies were real. More kids would be hurt. Unless the adults spreading misinformation faced real consequences, the cycle would continue. I couldn't stop all of them, but I could share our story. I started a blog under a pseudonym, detailing what had happened and warning parents about the real-world impact of their words. I wrote about how casual ableism and medical misinformation had nearly killed 6 children, how my daughter had paid the price for beliefs she'd absorbed from adults who should have known better. The blog gained traction, shared in parenting groups and disability advocacy circles. Some people attacked me. Others thanked me. I didn't care about the responses. I just needed people to understand that words had consequences. 3 years after we left our old town, we got news that the school district had implemented a comprehensive disability awareness program for all students K through 12. Teachers were required to complete annual training on accommodations and anti-bullying strategies specific to disabled students. Parents who complained publicly about accommodations faced education requirements before their children could continue attending. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. The superintendent mentioned in a press release that the changes were made in response to a serious incident that highlighted systemic failures. They didn't name Nora, but I knew they meant her. I felt strange about it, proud that something good had come from something terrible, angry that it had taken my daughter poisoning 6 kids to force change, sad that this was Nora's legacy in a place we'd never return to. Nora graduated from elementary school in Denver with honors and a certificate recognizing her volunteer work with disability advocacy organizations. At the ceremony, no one except us knew what she'd done 3 years earlier. No one knew she was the girl from the news story they might have seen. She'd been given the gift of anonymity and a fresh start, something not all children in her position received. She'd used that gift to become someone who fought for the vulnerable instead of harming them. During her graduation speech, the principal mentioned Nora as an example of students who demonstrated compassion and service. I cried listening to the principal describe my daughter that way, knowing what she'd overcome to deserve those words. Diane squeezed my hand and whispered that we'd made it. Our family had survived the worst thing we'd ever been through and come out damaged, but intact on the other side. Years later, when Nora was in high school, she asked if she could write about what had happened for a college essay. Dr. Patel thought it could be therapeutic if approached carefully. Nora wrote about believing misinformation as a child and the consequences of her actions. She wrote about learning that disabilities were real and that accommodations were necessary, not unfair. She wrote about the years of therapy and guilt and growth. She wrote about corresponding with Chloe and learning about forgiveness. She wrote about devoting her life now to advocacy and education so that other children wouldn't make her mistakes. The essay was powerful and honest and painful to read. She got into her first-choice university with a full scholarship based partly on that essay and her advocacy work. The admissions officer who called to congratulate her said Nora's self-awareness and commitment to making amends was remarkable in someone so young. On the 10-year anniversary of the incident, I found myself thinking about all 6 children Nora had harmed. I'd kept track of them as best I could through public records and social media. Chloe had graduated high school with plans to study medicine. The other kids seemed to be doing well too, though I couldn't know what private struggles they carried. I wondered if they still thought about that day, if they still had nightmares about not being able to breathe, if the trauma had shaped them in ways I couldn't see from a distance. I hoped they'd found healing and peace. I hoped they'd been able to move forward without being defined by what had happened to them. Then I looked at Nora, now 18 and preparing for college, volunteering with disability organizations, speaking at schools about the dangers of misinformation. She'd never be able to undo what she did, but she'd spent a decade trying to make amends through action and growth that had to count for something. Nora left for college with a box of letters from Chloe, kept carefully in a folder. The correspondence had dwindled as they'd both gotten older and busier, but they still exchanged cards at holidays. Chloe was going to medical school to become an allergist, she'd mentioned in her last card. She wanted to help people like herself and educate families about allergies. Nora told me she thought it was beautiful that something good had come from something so terrible, that Chloe had turned her trauma into purpose. I said Nora had done the same thing. She'd turned her worst mistake into a catalyst for change and advocacy. She'd become someone who protected people instead of harming them. She'd learned empathy the hardest way possible and had chosen to let it transform her rather than destroy her. As I watched her drive away to start her new life, I thought about how far we'd all come from that midnight phone call 10 years ago. The call that had shattered our family and forced us to rebuild. The call that had ended one version of our lives and started another. We'd survived, we'd grown, and somehow, impossibly, we'd found forgiveness and purpose in the wreckage. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.